So, trying to crack the code of Danish success, huh? We're going deep on how this small nation became such a global heavy hitter, especially in business and diplomacy.
What's fascinating about Denmark is they wield influence far beyond their size,
Hmm?
especially in areas like climate change. They've really mastered a unique approach to diplomacy.
It's not just about being nice, though, right? I mean, from what I've read, their culture is known for directness, maybe even bluntness at times. So, how does that play into international relations?
It's a great question because that directness is indeed central to Danish culture. But it's not about being harsh or anything like that. Think of it this way, a society where being straightforward is actually valued as a sign of respect for everyone's time. Less room for ambiguity, which in business negotiations, diplomatic talks can be really crucial.
Okay, so no beating around the bush, got it. But how does that play out in practice? Say you're in a meeting with Danish executives. What should you be prepared for?
Expect efficiency, that's for sure. Meetings are often short, very focused, and don't be surprised if your Danish counterparts just get right to the point. They really value clear, concise communication. But this doesn't mean relationships aren't important. Building trust is actually really essential, and that might involve grabbing a beer after work or engaging in some friendly banter before getting down to business.
Interesting, because I've heard they're really big on work-life balance too. So how does that square with this whole focus on efficiency?
It's all about finding the right balance. Danish companies are increasingly experimenting with things like 4-day work weeks
Mhm.
without reducing pay. Early data actually suggests that this leads to a boost in productivity. They've kind of recognized that well-rested, fulfilled employees, they're more engaged, more productive ultimately. And this really ties into their egalitarian ethos. It's not just about working less. It's about making sure everyone has the time, the resources to actually live a full life outside of work.
Which makes a lot of sense considering how much Danes value their personal time, especially those long summer vacations, right?
Precisely. You'd be hard-pressed to schedule a business meeting in July. It's practically sacred. But this emphasis on work-life balance, it also influences their approach to diplomacy in really interesting ways.
Okay, now I'm hooked. How does a nation's view on vacation time translate to the world stage?
Well, Denmark's diplomatic corps, they're known for their expertise, dedication, but they also understand that burnout helps no one. They're strategic about prioritizing issues, focusing on areas where they can have a tangible impact. So that might mean taking the lead on climate change negotiations or championing sustainable development in the Arctic.
So they're not spreading themselves too thin, they're focusing on their strengths, on their values.
Exactly. This targeted approach allows them to punch above their weight diplomatically. They're not trying to be everything to everyone, but they are seen as reliable and effective partners in key areas of global concern.
It's interesting how it all ties back to their cultural values. This whole emphasis on directness, work-life balance, the flat hierarchy, it's not just lip service. It seems deeply ingrained in how they approach everything, from business to international relations.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that really understanding a nation's cultural DNA is key to unlocking how they operate on the world stage. And Denmark, I think, is a fascinating case study in how to leverage these deeply held values for international influence.
Now, one thing we haven't touched on yet is their approach to decision-making. Given their emphasis on collaboration, on consensus, I imagine things could move a bit slowly.
That's a common perception, and there is some truth to it. The Danish approach to decision-making, especially in the business world, often involves multiple stakeholders. They value hearing different perspectives, building buy-in from the ground up. Now, while this can sometimes lead to lengthier processes, it also tends to result in more robust, more well-considered solutions in the end.
So it's like they're playing the long game, prioritizing sustainability, long-term success over those quick wins.
Exactly. And you can really see this long-term thinking in their approach to global challenges like climate change. They've been investing in renewable energy for decades, long before it became, well, a global imperative.
Right. I've read that Denmark is a world leader when it comes to wind energy. They've actually managed to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It is. They've kind of shown the world that a green transition, it's not only possible, but it can actually be economically advantageous.
Yeah.
And I think this success has given them a lot of credibility on the international stage. When Denmark speaks on climate change, people listen because they've walked the walk.
And this ties into this whole concept of soft power, right? This idea that you can influence the world through example, through values, rather than just military or economic might.
Absolutely. Denmark leverages its reputation for sustainability, for innovation, for social responsibility to really promote its agenda on a global scale. Think of it this way. Their investments in wind power, they haven't just reduced their own carbon footprint. They've positioned them as a global leader in a sector with huge growth potential. That gives them influence.
So it's a combination of action and advocacy. They're not just talking about the need to address climate change, they're demonstrating viable solutions at the same time.
Exactly. And they're actively sharing their knowledge, their technology with other nations, further solidifying, I think, their position as a real frontrunner in this global green transition.
Now, another area where Denmark punches above its weight is in the Arctic. What makes their approach to this region so unique?
The Arctic is really interesting. It's a region with, overlapping claims, potential resource competition, and obviously it's environmentally vulnerable, especially with climate change. Denmark's approach, particularly given their relationship with Greenland, really emphasizes international cooperation, what they call responsible governance.
So less about claiming territory, claiming resources, and more about working collaboratively with other Arctic nations.
Precisely. Denmark, they see the Arctic as this global commons, a
Yeah.
region where international cooperation is essential for everything. Addressing climate change, protecting biodiversity, ensuring sustainable development. They're particularly focused on working with indigenous communities, the people who are really on the front lines of these climate change impacts.
A very different approach than, say, a nation that's focused solely on resource extraction or, asserting its dominance in the region.
Very different. Denmark's Arctic strategy is really deeply rooted in their commitment to multilateralism, this idea that global problems, well, they require global solutions. And they see the Arctic Council, which brings together all the Arctic nations, as a vital forum for dialogue, for cooperation.
So for our listener, if they really want to understand Danish diplomacy, they need to understand how central this concept of multilateralism is to their entire worldview.
Absolutely. It underpins their entire foreign policy approach, from climate change to the Arctic to their active role in organizations like the United Nations. They fundamentally believe that working together is the only way to address these really complex challenges that we're facing in the world today.
And this ties back to their domestic culture, right? All this emphasis on collaboration and consensus building that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Their approach to international relations, it's really an extension of their domestic values. They see diplomacy as a process of building consensus, finding common ground, not so much as a zero-sum game.
It's fascinating, really, how this small nation has managed to carve out such a distinctive, such an influential role for itself on the world stage. But, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, there have to be challenges to this approach as well. What are some of the potential downsides to this heavy emphasis on consensus, on collaboration?
That's a fair point. One challenge is that the consensus building process, well, it can be time consuming. In situations that require, really rapid decision making, or when you're dealing with actors who don't necessarily share this collaborative approach, Denmark's model might face some limitations.
So while their long-term thinking is a real asset in a lot of situations, there are going to be cases where maybe a more agile approach, a more assertive approach is needed.
Precisely. And while their focus on soft power is highly effective, it also has its limitations. Influence without leverage only gets you so far.
Meaning they might face challenges when they have to deal with nations that are really prioritizing hard power or those who are just unwilling to engage in good faith diplomacy.
Exactly. And, their very strong stance on issues like human rights, climate change, as commendable as it is, might create some friction in certain situations.
So it's a real balancing act, right? They have to stay true to their values while also navigating, well, the realities of international relations, which aren't always pretty.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember that Denmark's foreign policy, like any nation's, it's constantly evolving. They've had their share of successes, they've had their setbacks, and they're going to continue to adapt their approach to meet the challenges of a rapidly changing world.
One thing that strikes me is that their approach to diplomacy, it seems remarkably consistent across different issues. Whether we're talking about climate change, the Arctic, even trade negotiations, they always seem to stick to this core set of principles. Collaboration, multilateralism, finding those win-win solutions.
Absolutely. There's remarkable coherence to their foreign policy.
Yeah.
And this stems from the fact that it's so deeply rooted in their national values. This isn't just about realpolitik. It's about who they are as a nation at their core.
And that authenticity, it really comes through in their diplomacy.
It does. They're not trying to be something they're not. They're comfortable with their place in the world, and they're using their strengths, their values, to make a positive contribution on the global stage.
It's inspiring, honestly. They're proof that you don't have to be a superpower to have a real impact on the world.
Indeed. They've shown that even a small nation can punch above its weight by being strategic, collaborative, principled, and how they approach international affairs.
Now, you mentioned that Denmark's foreign policy is constantly evolving. What are some of the key trends, some of the challenges that they're facing in today's world?
Well, one significant trend is this rise of populism, nationalism that we're seeing globally. This poses a real challenge to Denmark's commitment to multilateralism, to international cooperation.
Right, because if more and more nations start prioritizing their own narrow self-interest over global cooperation, well, it's going to be much harder to address these transnational issues, things like climate change, pandemics.
Exactly. And we're also seeing, kind of a shift in the global balance of power with the rise of new economic powers, new military powers. This is creating a more competitive, less predictable international environment.
So how is Denmark navigating this more, well, turbulent geopolitical landscape?
Well, they're adapting, but they're also sticking to their core principles. They're strengthening their alliances with like-minded nations, particularly within the European Union. And they're becoming more vocal in defending this rules-based international order that they see as, well, frankly, under threat.
So they're not shying away from these challenges, but they're also not about to abandon their commitment to diplomacy and cooperation.
Precisely. They recognize that the world needs more cooperation, not less, to address these complex challenges. And they're determined to play their part in building a more peaceful, a more sustainable, a more equitable future, really, for everyone.
It's ambitious for sure, but it seems to be what's driving their foreign policy agenda.
It is. And I think it's a goal worth striving for, even in the face of some really difficult challenges.
Now, we've talked a lot about Denmark's diplomatic successes, but what about their business world? How does this unique cultural landscape, how does that translate to the business world?
That's where things get really interesting, I think. Their business culture is a fascinating reflection of their broader societal values, and understanding these nuances is crucial for anyone who wants to succeed in the Danish market.
So it's not enough to just like brush up on your business etiquette.
No, not at all. You have to understand the underlying currents, the cultural currents that shape how they do business.
Give me an example. What's one key cultural element that might surprise foreign businesses?
Their approach to hierarchy, or rather, the lack of it. Danish businesses, they're incredibly flat in terms of organizational structure. So expect decisions to be made collaboratively with input from all levels of the organization.
So no, like dictatorial CEO calling all the shots.
Not quite. While Danish CEOs are respected leaders, they tend to encourage open dialogue, value the input from their team. So this collaborative approach, it might surprise those who are accustomed to more top-down management styles.
It sounds like adapting to this flat hierarchy, it would be crucial for anyone doing business in Denmark.
Absolutely. You need to be comfortable sharing your ideas openly, listening to diverse perspectives, and working collaboratively to find solutions.
This emphasis on collaboration, it really seems to be this recurring theme in Danish culture, doesn't it? Whether it's in their business practices, their diplomacy, their approach to work-life balance, it's everywhere.
You're absolutely right. It's fundamental to their societal DNA. It really permeates every aspect of their culture.
So if you're really trying to understand what makes Denmark tick on the world stage in the boardroom, you need to grasp this deep-rooted value of collaboration.
Precisely. It's the key that unlocks so much of what makes Denmark unique and ultimately successful.
So collaboration is key. It's like their secret sauce.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's not the only ingredient, right? There's also this real commitment to sustainability, to innovation, which I think is really appealing to foreign investors, businesses that are looking to the future.
It's like they're positioning themselves as this hub for ethical, forward-thinking businesses.
Precisely. They've managed to create this ecosystem that really fosters innovation, particularly in sectors like, well, clean energy, sustainable agriculture, life sciences.
So they've really positioned themselves as a leader in this transition to a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And this attracts talent, it attracts investment, it attracts partnerships from all over the globe.
Okay, but let's flip the script for a second. Let's say you're a business leader and you want to enter the Danish market. What are some common pitfalls, things to avoid?
One word: assumptions. Don't assume that what works in other markets will automatically translate to success in Denmark.
So don't underestimate the importance of really understanding those cultural nuances we've been talking about.
Exactly, like their direct communication style, for example. That can sometimes be misconstrued as, confrontational, but it's not. It's really about transparency. It's about efficiency. They value honesty. They value getting to the heart of the matter.
So leave the sales pitch at home and be prepared for, like, a frank, open discussion.
Precisely. And be prepared to actually back up your claims with data, with evidence. Danes, they're very analytical, very data-driven.
So no fluffy presentations, no empty promises.
Not if you actually want to earn their trust and their respect.
Now, what about language barriers? I mean, many Danes do speak English very fluently, but I imagine there are still challenges for foreign businesses.
Okay. You're right. While English proficiency is high, especially in business settings, you'll find that, a lot of key documents, legal contracts, marketing materials are often in Danish.
So relying solely on English could be a real misstep.
Definitely. It's crucial to have reliable translation services, interpretation services, to make sure that communication is crystal clear, avoid any costly misunderstandings.
And don't forget about those relationships. I mean, given their emphasis on collaboration, building strong personal connections is probably pretty essential to success there.
Absolutely. Invest the time to really get to know your Danish counterparts, build that trust, and really understand their perspectives.
So grab that after-work beer, engage in some friendly banter, show a genuine interest in their culture, their values.
Exactly. Remember, business in Denmark is often about building those long-term partnerships based on, well, mutual respect and understanding.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive here, it's clear that Denmark has some valuable lessons, both for the business world and for diplomacy. Their ability to, punch above their weight, their commitment to sustainability, that collaborative approach, it's really positioned them as a leader.
They've really shown the world that even a small nation can have a significant impact, especially when they stay true to their values, they focus on their strengths, and they're willing to collaborate with others.
So whether you're a CEO looking to, expand globally, a diplomat, or just someone who's interested in how the world works, Denmark's story, I think, offers some really valuable insights. They're proof that collaboration, innovation, this commitment to a better future can be really powerful forces for change.
Their model, well, it might not be easily replicated. It's deeply rooted in their specific history, their culture. But it certainly provides inspiration, I think, for anyone who wants to make a positive impact.
It's a good reminder that there are different ways of approaching success, ways that prioritize collaboration, sustainability, a genuine commitment to the greater good.
And as we navigate a world that's becoming more and more complex, more interconnected, well, those values are more important than ever.
There really are. So as you go about your day, think about this. What can we learn from Denmark? How can we take their collaborative spirit, their long-term thinking, their commitment to making a real difference? How can we incorporate that into our own lives, our own work? It's a question worth asking.
It is. And maybe, just maybe, if we embrace some of these values, we can all play our part in building a more sustainable, more equitable, more prosperous future for everyone.
Well said. On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Danish business and diplomacy. We hope you found it insightful. We hope you find it inspiring.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, keep asking those important questions.